I would say that this is also a failure of the UK media, and I really do think that, because I can assure you, I can't remember how long I've been doing this story for, but it's a long time now, like a decade and a half, and nobody really bothered very much with it at all. It was not the stories. The multiples of stories about Meghan compared to multiples of stories about this.
That's true.
After he had been pictured with Epstein, after all of these things, which was ages and ages ago, and they all knew off the sort of record and what people said about him, and yet the obsession was still with Meghan. And I remember doing this in 2019 and just thinking, this is absolutely bizarre. They're obsessed with the fact that Meghan and Harry have gone on a private jet to Ibiza. Look the other way. Why is the Queen just driven to Balmoral for this incredibly presentational event, always to church at Balmoral with him sitting next to her in the car? But they wouldn't say anything. The media is part of the establishment, and the establishment has now decided that cutting him loose is a more protective stance than doing what they did before, which was not properly interrogating it all. And the media is part of that to some extent. Not all. I can't characterize the whole media as one thing. No, I wouldn't begin to. But I will say that as someone who wrote about this for a very long time, there was a long, long period when they were far more interested in covering Meghan than looking into any of this stuff, even though large aspects of it were in the public domain.
Love it.
And
So let me make sure I heard that correctly. A podcast, calm, composed, not screaming into a void, not throwing plates across a studio, just casually sat there and said, yeah, the UK media kind of ignored serious issues for years and instead obsessed over Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. And the wildest part? That's not even a conspiracy theory. That's not Sussex fans being dramatic. That's not a Reddit thread someone cooked up at 2 a.m. That's just UK media admitting what we all knew. Because what you just heard wasn't exaggeration, it wasn't reaching, it wasn't emotional fans connecting invisible dots. It was someone from inside the system, from inside the very machine that produces these narratives, basically clearing their throat and saying, hey, maybe, just maybe, we were focusing on the wrong thing for, I don't know, a decade. A decade. 10 whole years, 3,652 days, give or take, of priorities being deliberately, consistently, suspiciously pointed in one direction. That's not a mistake. You don't accidentally ignore serious, publicly available information for 10 years. That's not an oversight. That's not a coincidence. That is a strategy. And today, we're going to talk about it. All of it. Because calling what Meghan received coverage is honestly too generous. It's almost an insult to actual journalism. Real coverage is when journalists investigate, verify, ask hard questions, face pushback, and report anyway. Real coverage is uncomfortable for the powerful and informative for the public. What Meghan got was a never-ending content machine that nobody commissioned, but everybody seemed to keep feeding. Every single day there was a new episode of a show nobody asked for, and every episode had the same title, just slightly remixed. Meghan breathes, but should she have? Meghan smiles. Sources say it was calculated. Meghan exists. A panel discussion. You had entire headlines, front page, primetime, breaking news energy dedicated to what she wore, how she walked, how she held her baby, how she ate, how she sat, how she hugged someone, how she didn't hug someone, what her facial expressions suggested about her true motives, whether her ponytail was an act of aggression. I am not exaggerating. At some point, I was genuinely waiting for the chyron to roll across the bottom of the screen. Breaking! Meghan blinks twice in 30 seconds. Royal experts alarmed. And somewhere, a panel of 6 people would have nodded gravely and said, "It does raise questions." Like, be serious. Meanwhile, and this is the part that should make every single person watching this pause, There were actual, substantial, serious issues floating around in the public domain. Not rumors, not fan speculation, not theories someone pieced together from blurry photos. Public domain, meaning anyone with a Wi-Fi connection, functioning eyes, and basic human curiosity could access this information. But the media looked at all of that and said, interesting. Anyway, let's zoom in on a private jet to Ibiza. Let's stay here for a moment, because the private jet saga truly deserves its own wing in a museum. Harry and Meghan take a private jet. That's it. That's the whole story. A couple on a plane going somewhere. And somehow, this became a DEFCON 1 media emergency. Hypocrisy! Climate disaster! How dare they? The same outlets that will casually profile billionaires island-hopping for lunch, the same publications that cover luxury yacht culture like it's aspirational content, the same media ecosystem that has never once asked a hedge fund manager how many tons of carbon their lifestyle produces, suddenly discovered their deep, passionate, burning commitment to environmentalism. I didn't know they cared so much. That's beautiful, honestly. That's character growth. I'm proud of them. Except, of course, this concern evaporated the second Harry and Meghan were no longer in the frame, because it was never about the planet. It was about the narrative, and the narrative needed fuel. And that week, Ibiza was the fuel. Here's what makes it truly fascinating from a media studies perspective. The jet story wasn't important. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't a matter of public interest in any meaningful sense. But it was usable. It could be dressed up as hypocrisy. It could generate clicks. It could get people emotionally activated, that sweet spot of not quite outrage, but definitely irritated, which is the exact emotional frequency that drives engagement. That's the formula, and they ran it on repeat. Now we get to the part that makes people genuinely uncomfortable, the relationship between the media and the establishment. And before anyone starts, no, this is not a conspiracy theory. Nobody is sitting in a secret underground bunker assigning Meghan headlines. But systems exist. Patterns exist. Incentives exist. And those three things together can produce outcomes that look, from the outside, a whole lot like coordination, even when nobody ever made a single phone call. Here's how access journalism works for anyone unfamiliar. You want insider information? You play nice. You want exclusive photos from royal events? You don't bite the hand. You want continued privileged access to powerful institutions, palaces, government offices, elite circles? You don't go nuclear. You don't print the story that burns the bridge. Not unless you absolutely have to. Not unless the story is so big, so undeniable, so impossible to contain that silence becomes more dangerous than truth. And so what happens in the meantime? Some stories get prioritized, others get delayed, some get reframed until they're unrecognizable, and some, the really inconvenient ones, get buried. Not with a shovel, not dramatically. They get buried under 47 articles about Meghan's tone of voice during a charity visit. They get buried under jet coverage and Ibiza think pieces and sources close to the palace say stories that somehow always manage to paint the same person in the same unflattering light week after week, year after year. When the podcast host said, almost casually, almost like it was obvious, they all knew, it was in the public domain, I've been covering this for years. That sentence should have broken the internet. They all knew. Not, we eventually discovered, not, once the information came to light. They knew. For years. And the response to knowing was more Ibiza coverage, more outfit analysis, more sources say she's difficult stories, more manufactured drama designed to keep a specific person at the center of a specific, carefully maintained negative narrative. That's not a media failure. That's a media choice. This is the part that people need to sit with, because it goes beyond personal dislike or tabloid gossip. Meghan wasn't just covered obsessively because journalists personally disliked her, though some clearly did. She was covered obsessively because she was useful, not as a human being, not as a wife, a mother, a duchess, a philanthropist, as a narrative device. Think about what she represented from a purely cynical media strategy perspective. She was American, already an outsider, already culturally coded as someone who didn't understand British tradition. She was mixed race, which in the UK media landscape opened up a particular set of ugly, coded narratives that certain outlets were more than happy to traffic in, usually with just enough plausible deniability to avoid direct accountability. She was an actress, which meant performative and calculated, could be attached to literally anything she did. She was confident and outspoken, which for a woman in her position in that institution was apparently unforgivable. She was an outsider who didn't seem interested in shrinking herself to fit a mold that was frankly already cracking. Put all of that together, and you don't just have a story, you have content goldmine. You don't even need facts. You just need angles. And once the machine starts producing content around a specific angle, it self-perpetuates. Other outlets pick up the frame. Audiences absorb the frame. The frame becomes the default lens through which everything is interpreted. Every kind action becomes a PR move. Every boundary becomes difficult behavior. Every moment of joy becomes, look how out of touch she is. Every moment of pain becomes, she is playing the victim. It's a closed loop, an airtight narrative box. And the most insidious part? Once you're inside it, there's no action you can take that isn't filtered through it. That's not journalism. That's character assassination with a style guide. The podcast specifically mentioned 2019, and that timestamp matters enormously, because 2019 was when the volume got turned all the way up. The scrutiny was relentless. The stories were coming daily. The narrative wasn't just being maintained, it was being aggressively escalated. Harry and Meghan were in South Africa on an official royal tour, doing actual substantive work, meeting with communities, engaging with serious issues on the continent. And what dominated the coverage back home? Drama, tension, sources say. An ITV documentary from that trip showed Meghan, visibly exhausted and emotionally raw, admitting she wasn't okay. The response from certain corners of the media? Not empathy, not reflection, not a single moment of, wait, should we maybe reassess how we've been covering this person? The response was essentially, she's being dramatic. And here's what was happening at the same time. While the cameras were focused on every micro-expression Meghan made during a public engagement, while editors were commissioning their 15th Why Meghan is the Problem column of the month, there were other stories. Stories with weight, stories with consequence, stories involving people with far more institutional power and far greater public responsibility than a duchess choosing where to vacation. Those stories existed. People in media knew they existed. Some were even openly discussing them in certain circles. But the front pages had already been decided, and they did not feature those stories. Here's the twist that the podcast landed on, and it is rich. After years of looking away, after years of prioritizing Meghan's every movement over genuinely serious matters of public concern, the establishment, and by extension its media, has apparently decided that accountability is now on the menu. Oh, now we're doing scrutiny? Now questions are being asked? Now the energy that was previously reserved for analyzing a duchess's curtsy is being redirected toward actual wrongdoing? That's adorable. Truly adorable. Because accountability that only arrives when it's safe isn't really accountability. Accountability that emerges only once the momentum has already shifted, once the outcome is already leaning in a particular direction, once the risk of speaking up has been dramatically reduced, that's convenience dressed in accountability's clothing. It's showing up to a house fire with a glass of water after the building has already burned to the ground and saying, very seriously, "I'm here to help." And the timing is not a coincidence. It never is. The powerful get protected until protecting them becomes more expensive than exposing them. That's not cynicism. That's just how institutional dynamics work, historically, repeatedly, across cultures and contexts. The question isn't why accountability is happening now. The question is, what changed the calculation? To be fair, and we should be fair, even when the subject doesn't deserve excessive generosity, the podcast did include a careful disclaimer: not all media. And yes, that's true. There are journalists doing extraordinary, thankless, important work. There are outlets that prioritized substance over spectacle. There are reporters who covered serious stories seriously and didn't spend their careers manufacturing outrage about someone's wardrobe choices. They exist. They matter. Their work matters. But here's the honest reality. It doesn't have to be all media for the damage to be done. It just has to be enough. Enough outlets to dominate the news cycle, enough front pages to shape the public conversation, enough repetition to train audiences about who deserves empathy and who doesn't, enough noise to drown out everything else. And for a sustained, significant period of time, the dominant, loudest, most widely circulated narrative was Meghan equals problem, not institution with accountability issues, not serious allegations involving powerful people, not systemic failures requiring investigation, just Meghan. The Meghan narrative was simple, repeatable, and emotionally activating. It required no investigation. It generated no legal risk. It cost nothing to produce and everything to maintain. Except, of course, the truth. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations. Media doesn't just report stories. It trains audiences. It tells you, not explicitly but through repetition and emphasis and framing, what to care about, what to be angry about, what to find suspicious, what to ignore. This is not a new observation. Media scholars have been writing about agenda setting and framing theory for decades. It's not controversial. It's established, documented, studied. When you see the same story framed the same way in the same emotional register from multiple sources over an extended period of time, it doesn't just inform you, it shapes you. It calibrates your instincts. It tells your brain, this is important, this is a threat, this person should be viewed with suspicion. And after years of that kind of conditioning, you end up in a situation where large numbers of people are more emotionally activated by a duchess's travel choices than by credible, documented, publicly available information about actual wrongdoing by people with actual power. That does not happen by accident. That is the result of sustained, deliberate, strategic narrative construction. Call it what you want, dress it up however you like, but that's what it is. So why does a single podcast clip warrant this much conversation? Because it's rare. It is genuinely, remarkably rare for someone from within media circles to stand in front of an audience and say, essentially, we knew. The information was there, and we covered Ibiza instead. Even wrapped in careful language, even cushioned in qualifications, even delivered in a calm, measured podcast tone rather than a tearful confession, the message is still there. And it validates what many people, particularly those who followed the story closely, who watched the coverage in real time, who could see the disproportion with their own eyes, have been saying for years. Years during which they were told they were biased, oversensitive, parasocial, or simply wrong. They weren't wrong. The information was there. The choices were made. And now, slowly, uncomfortably, the acknowledgement is beginning to surface. At the end of all of this, it's important to zoom out, because this conversation has never really just been about Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, as much as she has been at the center of it. She is the case study, the vivid, high-profile, extensively documented illustration of how a narrative can be constructed around a person, maintained through institutional infrastructure, and used, deliberately or opportunistically, to redirect public attention away from things that genuinely matter. She is the example that makes the abstract concrete. The broader issue is this: attention is finite. When it is consumed by one carefully maintained story, it is necessarily taken away from others. When millions of people's emotional energy, moral outrage, and daily information diet is saturated with coverage of someone's vacation, or someone's tone of voice, or someone's fashion choices, there is less room. Less room for the harder stories, less bandwidth for the complicated truths. Less space for the kind of slow, sustained, patient attention that serious accountability journalism actually requires. And someone, somewhere, benefits from that. Every time. So here's where we land. The next time you see 15 articles about a single outfit choice, ask what you're not reading. The next time a royal source manufactures drama out of a normal human moment, ask what that energy is being redirected from. The next time someone gets turned into a villain in a story that conveniently requires no investigation, no serious journalism, and no accountability from anyone powerful, ask who benefits from that story existing. Because a calm, measured podcast conversation can casually surface years of journalistic malpractice, almost as a footnote, almost as an aside. Imagine what else is sitting in plain sight. Imagine what's already in the public domain. Imagine what's been there for years, waiting for someone to point the camera in the right direction. The noise was never random. The distraction was never accidental. And Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, a real person, a mother, a woman who came into one of the most scrutinized institutions on earth and refused to disappear, she deserved journalism. What she got was a machine, and it's past time we called the machine by its actual name. Thank you for watching. Happy Sunday. See you in the next video.